Enter at your own risk. This is one of the darkest stories ever told from the Tennessee. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you hear this. Because once you do, you'll realize these stories don't stay in the past. They follow you. They told you the orphanages were places of mercy, safe houses for the abandoned, cradles for the innocent. But what if I told you that in the back roads of Tennessee, behind black iron gates in 1888, the word orphanage meant something else entirely? What if it meant an unmarked graveyard, a factory of silence, a machine built to erase names from history before they could even learn to spell them? Picture this, a cold November night. The fog sits heavy along the Cumberland River. Lanterns swing dimly against brick walls where shadows seem too restless to be natural. A building, 3 stories tall, red-bricked and windowless on the upper floors, rises like a mausoleum in the night. The local paper called it the Tennessee Children's Refuge, but the locals whispered a different name. They called it the house that fed on children. When the inspectors came, they were greeted with smiles, clean sheets, bowls of porridge carefully staged, but they never went upstairs. They never saw the attic where 40 iron cribs were lined against the wall, each with straps instead of blankets. They never saw the staircase that had been bricked over from the inside, sealing whatever lived or died behind it. And they never saw the ledger, a leather-bound book that listed every child who entered. Not one page bore the word adopted. Instead, beside each name, a single mark, a cross. The townspeople claimed they heard things at night, wails carried across the river, small hands pounding against glass, a bell that rang at exactly 3:07 in the morning, though no bell was ever installed in the building, and those who and to investigate, farmhands, drunks, even a deputy, never returned. Their families were told they left town, but everyone knew. The orphanage didn't just take children. It took anyone foolish enough to look too closely. This is not folklore. This is not a ghost story meant to scare you into sleep. The state archives of Tennessee still carry fragments of this case, tucked away under miscellaneous. Newspaper clippings redacted, court transcripts half-burned, an entire institution wiped clean from official records. Yet survivors, few, broken, but breathing, have told their pieces. And when you stitch those fragments together, something horrifying comes into view. Tonight, I'm not here to tell you about an orphanage. I'm here to tell you about a system older than Tennessee, older than America itself. A system that hides its cruelty behind charity, that feeds on the nameless, and that ensures its legacy survives through silence. And the silence has lasted more than a century. The first official mention of the Tennessee orphanage came in the spring of 1888, buried deep in the Nashville Banner, a single column praising the charitable efforts of a group of concerned matrons and clergymen who had established a refuge for abandoned children outside Clarksville. The article read like a hymn, speaking of mercy, Christian duty, and the noble cause of saving young souls from the street. But when you strip away the language of piety, what you find is a convenient veil, a curtain pulled across something rotten. Because in those same months, county records list an unusual number of infant deaths marked as cholera, pneumonia, or failure to thrive. Yet the epidemic reports for that region show no such outbreaks. The numbers don't line up. The illnesses didn't exist. Something else was killing these children. And here's where the cracks in the facade grow darker. When the property was inspected for taxation, the surveyor noted large parcels of land behind the main building marked unused pasture. But when surveyors decades later dug beneath that same pasture, they unearthed shallow pits containing bones, small bones, arranged in clusters. The soil told the truth the paper refused to print. Neighbors, when questioned, spoke of wagons arriving late at night, covered, heavy, pulled by teams of horses, entering through the rear gate and leaving lighter. Some said the wagons carried firewood. Others swore they heard whimpers inside, but no one challenged it because the orphanage had powerful allies. It was funded not just by the church, but by the county magistrate himself, a man with interests in land development and a history of silencing dissent. And when anyone asked why so many children died in care, the official response was always the same: the orphans were weak, born to sin, burdened by poor blood. It was, they said, God's will. But the numbers rose, and the silence grew thicker. By the end of 1889, nearly 70 children had been recorded as lost under the orphanage's care. 70 names that vanished into dust. And yet the building kept receiving funds, kept bringing in more children, kept swallowing the voiceless. Think about it. Who questions the fate of the unwanted? Who counts the children no one claims? That is the perfect crime. Prey on those no one defends. And it wasn't just Tennessee. It was a pattern, a blueprint repeated across America, each orphanage tied by invisible strings to institutions we are taught to trust. By 1890, whispers about the orphanage began to reach the edges of the public, but those whispers never became shouts because the voices carrying them were silenced one by one. A farmer named Elias Crow, whose land bordered the institution, reported to the county clerk that he had seen children wandering the fields at night, barefoot, pale, and silent as if drugged. He claimed some of them didn't seem alive at all, that they moved strangely, jerking like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Within weeks of making his report, Crow's barn mysteriously burned to the ground, and he was later found drowned in the river with his pockets filled with stones. The coroner declared it suicide, but his family insisted Elias had never once shown despair. And yet no investigation followed, no arrests made. Others who spoke up met similar fates. A schoolteacher who tried to question the rising number of orphans lost to illness vanished on her way home from Sunday service. A young constable who tried to open a formal inquiry was abruptly reassigned out of county and later dismissed for dereliction of duty. What we see here is the machinery of suppression, the hand behind the curtain. The orphanage was not some rogue charity gone astray. It was protected, shielded, even celebrated by those with the most to lose if its truths were uncovered. And that protection points us toward something more than local corruption. Consider the timing. America in the late 19th century was expanding, industrializing, swallowing human lives for profit in mines, mills, and factories. Orphans, stripped of names, family, and advocates, became the easiest resource to harvest. Cheap labor, test subjects, currency for darker exchanges. Reports from survivors, rare, fragmented, often dismissed, tell of children taken from their cribs at night and never returned. Of experiments with tonics that made them slaves, for days, of priests and matrons whispering prayers in languages no child understood, surrounding the beds with symbols drawn in ash. These fragments paint a picture of something not merely criminal, but ritualistic, systematic, almost cult-like. And when you understand how power works, when you study the architecture of control, you begin to see the pattern. Institutions that wear the mask of charity to cover the machinery of exploitation. What happened in Tennessee was not a haunting in the way ghost stories are told. It was a haunting in the way power lingers in brick and bone, a residue of suffering so immense it carves itself into the walls. And the walls of that orphanage still stand in part today, though the state refuses to acknowledge them. By the early 1890s, the institution had become something of a paradox in the region, publicly praised for its charity work, yet privately feared like a cursed ground no one dared approach after sundown. Farmers swore their cattle refused to graze near the property's fence line, dogs howled when led too close, and even seasoned hunters avoided the nearby woods, claiming they heard the faint sound of children sobbing long after midnight. But the true horror lay in the testimonies of those who somehow survived its walls. One boy, later known only as Samuel H., spoke in a 1932 interview, his voice trembling even as an old man, about the nights when men in black coats arrived by carriage, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats. He remembered being awakened by a lantern's glow, being carried from his crib into a lower chamber where the air stank of mildew and iron. He described rows of tables where children were laid side by side, and a man with cold hands pressing a bitter liquid to their lips. Most never woke again. Those who did spoke in whispers afterward, claiming they had seen women in veils walking between the tables, humming hymns that were not quite Christian. Samuel claimed he learned quickly to fake sleep, to let his body go limp, and that pretense is what kept him alive. He never saw the other children again. What chills the blood is that his account, dismissed as the ramblings of an elderly man, matched almost exactly the private notes of a local doctor who had once been called to treat an ailing orphan. In those notes, he recorded finding the child's skin covered in strange burns, circular marks that could not be explained by disease or accident. When he pressed for answers, the matron warned him that charity was a delicate arrangement and that some questions would put his license at risk. The doctor never returned, and his files disappeared from county archives until decades later when fragments were discovered in his granddaughter's attic. Piece by piece, the veil lifts, and the pattern emerges. Children weren't merely neglected. They were consumed by something larger, something hidden under the language of mercy. And here is the part most people cannot bear to hear. The orphanage wasn't an isolated abomination. It was one of many, nodes in a shadow network stretching across states, each feeding the same insatiable appetite for power, profit, and secrecy. Tennessee was not the beginning, and it certainly was not the end. The deeper one digs into the Tennessee case, the harder it becomes to dismiss it as mere rumor or the isolated cruelty of a single institution. Financial records from the late 19th century, though fragmented and obscured by deliberate tampering, reveal unexplained donations pouring in from wealthy benefactors across several states, men whose names also appear in the ledgers of other benevolent homes in Kentucky, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The pattern is unmistakable. Orphanages were not only places of care, but also reservoirs of human lives, and those lives were quietly traded like assets. Court transcripts buried in county records and barely legible from time's decay mention missing witnesses, children who vanished before hearings, and jurors pressured into silence. And then there are the letters, private correspondence between matrons of different orphanages, written in a code of pious language. They spoke of harvests that would be plentiful, of midnight visitations and deliveries completed. When deciphered, these words appear less like innocent metaphors and more like logistics reports for something far more sinister. Survivors who came forward decades later often mentioned being transported by wagon or train under the cover of night, sent to unknown destinations, sometimes returned, sometimes not. This mobility points to a network, a latticework of hidden corridors beneath the surface of polite society, where the bodies of the forgotten were currency. The Tennessee orphanage was a doorway, not a destination. Behind its locked wards and whispered hymns, one can almost glimpse the machinery of a larger enterprise, a system where the poor and voiceless were raw material and the powerful carved profit from their silence. Churches preached charity while looking the other way. Doctors signed off on deaths that were never truly investigated. Politicians accepted contributions and blocked inquiries. And yet, beneath all the paperwork, one truth echoes louder than the rest. This was not chaos. It was order. An order designed to vanish children while cloaking itself in sanctity. Once you understand that Tennessee was merely one spoke in a vast, hidden wheel, you can no longer see the orphanage as an aberration. It was a symptom of a disease pulsing through America itself, a disease of secrecy, hierarchy, and appetite that fed on the most defenseless and left no trace but whispers and graves too small for the numbers claimed. By the turn of the century, the so-called reform era swept across America like a cleansing fire, or so it was preached from pulpits and platforms. Child labor laws, new welfare programs, and charitable reforms were heralded as the moral triumph of a civilized nation finally ready to care for its weakest. But buried beneath the public speeches and newspaper headlines, these very reforms tightened the stranglehold of the orphanage system, giving its operators unprecedented power. Under new legislation, county officials were granted authority to remove children from unfit homes, often defined with vague, elastic language that could mean anything from poverty to immorality, from sickness to mere gossip of neglect. Mothers who fell ill, fathers who lost work, families whose neighbors whispered of bad habits, all became easy prey for the state. Children were seized not because they were abandoned, but because their guardians were poor, inconvenient, or politically voiceless. And once the children were inside the walls, oversight evaporated. Reports were filed, but never read. Inspections were scheduled, but announced in advance, giving institutions time to scrub the worst evidence. The reform laws did not starve the network, they fed it. Orphanages swelled with new bodies, each one tagged as a ward of the state, each one legally invisible once signed over to institutional care. What appeared to be the dawn of compassion was in fact the codification of disappearance. This explains why ledgers from Tennessee, Ohio, and Illinois suddenly triple in size after 1905, recording more admissions than the population of some towns could even produce. It also explains the rise of mysterious transfer orders, documents shuffling children between states, erasing their paper trails before they could ever be reclaimed by family. Survivors would later describe the same process. Men with lip boards and sealed envelopes arriving in the dead of night, gathering a group of children, loading them into wagons, and driving them away while others watched in silence, knowing they would never see them again. The cruel genius of the progressive reforms was this: they wrapped the machinery of disappearance in the language of salvation. A country that congratulated itself for protecting children never questioned why so many vanished, nor why those who returned bore scars, missing memories, and hollow eyes. What looked like mercy from the outside was in truth a perfected system of control, a system that expanded without resistance because it disguised its hunger as compassion. By the 1910s, the whispers shifted from mere neglect and disappearance to something far colder: experimentation. America was entering its so-called age of science, when laboratories were hailed as temples of progress and doctors as high priests of knowledge. Orphanages, brimming with children no one would miss, became an irresistible reservoir for those who sought human subjects under the guise of research. Reports that surfaced decades later tell of physicians arriving with trunks of instruments, notebooks, and vials filled with strange solutions. They called their visits medical examinations, but survivors recalled needles driven deep into veins, liquids that burned like fire coursing through their bodies, and pills that left them convulsing until unconsciousness claimed them. One boy remembered being placed in a freezing bath and kept there while men recorded his shivering until his body went still, then dragged back into the dormitory as though nothing had happened. A girl spoke of wires attached to her scalp, the crackle of electricity, and the smell of her own singed hair while she screamed into the dark. None of this was written in official reports, yet fragments of correspondence between institutions betray their reality. Doctors spoke of yielding data and sacrifices justified by progress. Some experiments were cloaked in the language of eugenics, the poisonous philosophy that claimed the weak must be studied, managed, or eliminated for the betterment of society. What chills the blood is not only what was done, but how it was justified. These children were wards of the state, legally severed from family ties, existing in a gray zone where their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the institutions that housed them. To officials, they were property, statistics, mouths to feed, and occasionally material for inquiry. The orphanages, once dressed up as sanyi, quarries of charity, were now quietly transformed into laboratories where innocence was the price of progress, and society applauded, blind to the screams that never left the walls. This is where the Tennessee case bleeds into the larger pattern across America, the realization that care was not the mission, but a mask for experiments that would have been impossible in any other setting. Here, hidden behind sermons and whitewashed walls, the future of control was being written on the fragile bodies of the forgotten. The deeper one follows the trail, the more undeniable the connections become. Elite funding and universities were not passive observers, but active participants in transforming orphanages into hidden laboratories. Philanthropic trusts, often praised in the newspapers for their gifts to child welfare, funneled enormous sums into these institutions, but the money never went toward better food, warmer clothes, or safer quarters. Instead, receipts reveal orders for surgical tools, chemicals, and even electrical equipment far beyond what any orphanage could justify for routine care. University records, though carefully sanitized, show professors and graduate students making field visits to affiliated homes, trips conveniently left out of public reports, but noted in private journals. In one striking case, a ledger from an Ohio orphanage listed payments marked only as "for specimens delivered," coinciding with lab notes from a nearby medical college that spoke of young subjects exhibiting unusual resilience. The phrasing was clinical, detached, as if they were writing about animals instead of children. These universities, hungry for prestige and eager to ride the wave of scientific discovery, accepted such material without question. And the benefactors, wealthy men whose names still adorn campus buildings today, stood at the crossroads, laundering cruelty into philanthropy. For them, it was a perfect transaction. Their reputations were gilded with charity, the institutions expanded their research without public scrutiny, and the orphanages were left to continue their harvest in silence. Survivors who spoke decades later often mentioned visitors arriving who seemed different from the usual staff, men with fine coats, polished shoes, and the cool, observing eyes of academics. They rarely spoke to the children but watched, took notes, and sometimes directed the procedures through themselves. The chilling realization is that the suffering was not random, nor was it merely the excess of cruel caretakers. It was structured, funded, and academically legitimized. The experiments carried out in these hidden chambers were not accidents of neglect. They were deliberate steps in a long chain of sanctioned inquiry, where children were stripped of identity and reduced to data points. And yet, when the results were published, they appeared in journals under vague language, citing unusual case studies or anonymous juvenile subjects, as though the agony of the orphaned could be erased with a few strokes of academic detachment. It is here that the mask of benevolence fully slips, revealing the machinery of power at its most efficient. Charity as a doorway, science as a justification, and innocence as fuel for an empire of knowledge built upon silence and bones. The cover-ups were as meticulous as the experiments themselves, woven into a web of silence that stretched from the orphanage matron all the way to the State House. Whenever rumors escaped the walls, when a child died suddenly, when a local doctor questioned the bruises or burns, when a grieving mother dared to demand answers, paperwork appeared to smother the trail. Death certificates listed vague causes like consumption, failure to thrive, or natural decline, even when the body bore marks no natural illness could explain. Inquests, when called, were handled by coroners with financial ties to the very benefactors funding the institutions. Newspapers occasionally printed whispers of abuse, but retractions followed within days, often after anonymous donations arrived to support local journalism. University records were scrubbed clean, course logs altered to erase the names of students who had spent entire seasons inside orphanage walls, and whenever survivors managed to speak out, often decades later, they were dismissed as confused, traumatized, or fabricating for attention. One case in Kentucky in 1921 shows the precision of the silencing machine. A boy's body, scarred by burns and puncture wounds, was presented to the county coroner by horrified townsfolk. The orphanage produced a signed affidavit from 2 doctors stating the child had succumbed to a congenital weakness. When a local minister threatened to raise the issue from his pulpit, a delegation of wealthy men visited him that night. By Sunday morning, his sermon praised the orphanage for its tireless sacrifice on behalf of society. The machinery worked because every link in the chain, politicians, clergy, academics, and the press, was fed by the same system of influence and money. The silence was not passive, it was enforced, cultivated, and bought. Survivors described being threatened with eternal damnation if they spoke of what they saw, told that their memories were the devil's lies, and beaten when they resisted. By the time they grew old enough to leave, they carried scars not just on their bodies, but on their tongues, conditioned to remain silent for life. This explains why so few testimonies survived, why so little hard evidence exists today. The institutions did not merely consume the children, they consumed the truth itself, burying it under layers of bureaucracy, piety, and philanthropy. What remains are fragments, scattered like bones across time, requiring the patient and the fearless to assemble the hidden body of history. And in that assembly lies a revelation too disturbing for polite society to ever willingly acknowledge. The orphanages were not a failure of charity, but a successful system of control, one protected by the very pillars of power that claimed to stand for justice, mercy, and truth. Entire towns became complicit, their survival tied to the orphanage's dark economy, making silence not just preferable, but profitable. The institutions provided steady employment for cooks, groundskeepers, seamstresses, and guards. They bought supplies from local merchants, hired laborers for expansions, and drew in donations that trickled into the community's banks. To question the orphanage was to risk one's livelihood, and so the people learned to look away. Farmers delivered food and never asked why the same orders increased, even as the children inside seemed fewer each year. Carpenters repaired rooms they were forbidden to enter, their hammers echoing in halls that reeked of disinfectant and blood. Even the town's churches benefited, receiving generous tithes from orphanage patrons who sat in the front pews, their reputations shining while whispers of cruelty were relegated to the back alleys. Shopkeepers noticed doctors buying strange instruments, and blacksmiths were paid to forge locks heavy enough to bar more than escape. They sealed secrets. Town constables, often underpaid and eager for stability, accepted stipends to patrol the grounds at night, ensuring no child ever made it to the road with their story intact. A community's moral compass is easily swayed when its pocket depends on silence, and in these towns, the orphanage stood as both employer and jailer, charity and curse. Children became invisible currency, traded for influence, research, and profit, while the townspeople played their parts in the unspoken pact: don't ask, don't see, don't speak. Survivors would later recall how they tried to scream through barred windows, their voices swallowed by the wind, while townsfolk walked past on their way to Sunday service. The cruelty lay not only in the acts committed within the walls, but in the willful blindness of those who lived just beyond them, who sit down, hose bread, and stability over truth. This is how the system endured, by entwining itself so deeply into the fabric of community life that tearing it down would mean unraveling the town itself. And so the townspeople defended the orphanage when outsiders asked questions, insisting it was a place of mercy, all the while knowing that too many children entered its gates and far too few ever walked out again. It wasn't just an institution hidden in plain sight. It was a partnership between power and community, built on fear, dependence, and denial. Religion became the perfect shroud, wrapping atrocity in the language of holiness, ensuring that the system appeared untouchable because it was sanctified from the pulpit. Churches not only endorsed the orphanages, but often operated them, presenting themselves as guardians of abandoned souls while acting as gatekeepers of silence. Priests, pastors, and nuns invoked Scripture to justify obedience, telling children that suffering was their cross to bear, that their pain was a path to salvation. Survivors recalled being marched into chapels, forced to kneel while hymns echoed through stained glass, the very hands that blessed them by day becoming the same hands that restrained, struck, or delivered them into the experiments at night. Sermons preached in town painted the orphanages as beacons of mercy, their matronly caretakers as angels of charity, while behind closed doors those angels became wardens. Whenever rumors threatened to spread, church leaders rallied the faithful to defend the institution, warning that critics were agents of the devil or enemies of God's work. Donations were collected at Sunday service, flowing into the same coffers that purchased medical instruments and reinforced barred windows. Even more insidious, confessional booths became tools of control. Children who whispered their terror to priests were told to repent their doubts and accept God's will, their cries smothered by absolution that doubled as threat. The hierarchy of faith was weaponized. Questioning the orphanage meant questioning God, and to question God was heresy. And so the system remained shielded, because who would dare accuse the church of evil when it draped itself in sacraments and scripture? Communities clung to the illusion that holiness resided within those walls, preferring to believe the sermons over the screams. In truth, the church provided the moral camouflage that allowed, with the machinery to run unchecked, laundering cruelty into piety and turning atrocity into ritual. What the children endured was not merely neglect, it was a liturgy of suffering, baptized in silence and justified by verses that twisted faith into a weapon. The stain runs deeper than any one denomination. Across states, across decades, religion served as the sacred seal that kept the truth buried. And when the final prayers were spoken over the small graves behind the walls, they were not blessings but disguises. Words meant not to honor the dead, but to hide them. One more layer of sanctity covering the bones of the forgotten. The state was no bystander. It was an architect, weaving the orphanages into its machinery of power and using them as tools of political gain. Legislators who proudly proclaimed their devotion to children's welfare passed laws that funneled public money into these institutions, securing both their survival and their silence. Governors posed for photographs with smiling matrons, parading orphans in staged events while the real suffering remained locked behind barred doors. Political campaigns were lubricated with donations from the same wealthy benefactors who funded the orphanages, ensuring that no official dared question the system that sustained their careers. In return, investigations were stalled, audits buried, and reports rewritten to erase damning details. Even when whispers of abuse reached the halls of government, the response was carefully calculated. Appoint a commission, delay hearings, let public outrage fade, and then declare reforms that did nothing but strengthen the orphanage's authority. The state's involvement ran deeper still. Orphans were conscripted into labor programs under the guise of rehabilitation, leased out to farms, factories, and households where they worked without pay, their wages pocketed by the institution. Records show governors approving contracts that treated children as commodities, assigning quotas as if they were livestock. And because these children were wards of the state, they had no legal recourse, no families to advocate, no voices that could pierce the legal armor binding them in silence. Some were even funneled into military schools or experimental work camps, their bodies and minds molded to serve the needs of industry and war. The orphanages became a reservoir not only for medical experimentation, but also for cheap labor and political theater, each child reduced to a number that served the ambitions of men in office. When scandals threatened to rise, politicians invoked the same rhetoric as the clergy, claiming critics were undermining the sacred mission of charity. Thus, the state and the church formed an unholy alliance, each shielding the other, each feeding on the same invisible harvest. The orphanages were not rogue actors hiding from authority. They were instruments of it, sanctioned and sustained because they provided what power always seeks: resources, obedience, and silence. And so the machinery kept turning, greased by laws and prayers alike, grinding innocence into currency while America congratulated itself for its progress and mercy. By the late 19th century, the orphanages had become more than holding cells for the abandoned. They were factories of exploitation, feeding America's hunger for cheap labor under the mask of moral responsibility. Reports buried deep in county ledgers reveal contracts signed between orphanage directors and local landowners, granting them temporary custody of children in exchange for meager payments that never reached the wards themselves. Boys as young as 7 were marched into tobacco fields, their small hands raw and blistered from endless hours of cutting and binding leaves, while girls were dispatched to wealthy homes as servants, scrubbing floors and tending fires until their knuckles cracked. None of this was hidden. It was written into the very mission of the institutions, described in glowing terms as teaching the value of hard work or preparing the indigent for useful lives. But the truth was unmistakable. These children were commodities, their labor leased to fuel the economy of a rapidly industrializing nation. Mills and factories in Tennessee kept their looms turning by stocking them with orphans who had no wages to demand, no families to resist, and no choice but to obey. Some worked 12-hour shifts under supervisors who knew that no sheriff or magistrate would listen if a child whispered of beatings or abuse. Orphanage records, carefully scrubbed for public view, used euphemisms like placed in service or assigned to apprenticeship, concealing the reality of forced labor that stripped children of both freedom and identity. Even when they remained inside the walls of the orphanage, the exploitation continued. Brickmaking, laundry, sewing, and carpentry were demanded daily, the profits flowing not to the children, but to the directors and their patrons. And as industries prospered, politicians praised the institutions for their efficiency highly, showing them as proof that society could transform helpless waifs into productive citizens. The irony was brutal. America's proudest talk of freedom and progress was built on the backs of children who had neither. Every harvest, every rail laid, every house kept tidy by a silent orphan was a ghost in the ledger of prosperity, a body used up by a system that called itself benevolent while grinding its victims into dust. What began as charity had become a shadow economy, invisible yet indispensable, where innocence itself was the raw material of wealth. The labor was not just a theft of time and childhood. It was a psychological crucible designed to break the mind as much as the body. Imagine a boy of 9 rising before dawn, his bones still soft, sent into a field not as a child but as a tool, whipped into obedience by overseers who called him by number, not name. The girls fared no better, told daily that their worth lay in silence, in servitude, in the ability to endure without complaint. Day after day, they were taught not only to labor, but to erase themselves, to become instruments rather than individuals. Over time, the children began to mirror their captors' cruelty, turning on each other with small acts of betrayal, hoarding scraps of food, reporting whispered dissent in hopes of earning favor. This was no accident. It was conditioning. The orphanages thrived not merely on physical exploitation, but on the dismantling of identity, shaping minds to accept domination as natural. Diaries that slipped past the fire pits of censors reveal haunting testimonies. Children describing dreams where they were still working even in sleep, others confessing that they no longer remembered their mothers' faces, only the sting of straps across their backs. Teachers and ministers spoke of instilling discipline, but what they instilled was obedience, the kind that made men easy to draft into armies and women easy to consign to servitude. And beneath it all was the unspoken experiment. What happens when you take the most vulnerable souls and subject them to relentless deprivation, labor, and control? The result was not merely tired children, but fractured adults, people released into society carrying invisible wounds that would echo through generations. Some never escaped the walls in their minds, living their entire lives as if still under the orphanage's watchful eye. Others repeated the cycle, harsh with their own children, because cruelty was the only language they had ever been taught. This was the true legacy of America's orphanages. Not just stolen childhoods, but engineered submission. A hidden army of broken spirits forged under the pretense of care. It is here, in the psychological ruin, that we see the machinery of power at its most insidious. Not content with taking years of labor, it took the very architecture of the soul, ensuring that the oppressed would never rise against the hands that shaped them. Once the children's bodies were worn down by endless labor and their spirits fractured by years of enforced silence, they became something else entirely, raw material for the ambitions of science, cloaked in progress. The late 19th century was an age obsessed with medicine, with experimentation, with the idea that human suffering could be justified if it advanced knowledge, and orphanages provided a supply of subjects no one would miss. In Tennessee, quiet contracts were forged between directors and physicians eager to test new treatments, vaccines, and surgical methods. Children were lined up in infirmaries not to be healed, but to be observed, injected, and dissected by men who spoke of them as cases, not lives. Records hidden in university archives speak of smallpox inoculations administered not once but repeatedly, far beyond safe dosage, just to track reactions. Others were subjected to chemical tonics, their bodies catalogued for side effects, their pain reduced to data points. The younger the child, the more useful they were considered, because their bodies responded quickly and revealed truths about physiology that textbooks could not provide. And behind the closed doors of some orphanages, surgeons practiced procedures meant for adults: amputations, trepanning, experimental anesthetics, leaving children scarred, paralyzed, or dead, with causes of death listed simply as illness. The state permitted it, the clergy excused it, and the medical journals of the time scrubbed these experiments clean by reporting only results, never sources. A child's scream in the night became a line in a ledger: subject unresponsive, procedure terminated. It was not healing, it was harvesting. The public was told these institutions existed to nurture the forgotten, yet behind their stone walls, the forgotten became consumables in a system that valued knowledge more than compassion. And the cruelest truth is that many of the advancements celebrated in American medicine carried the fingerprints of these children, discoveries baptized not in progress but in blood. The orphanages became laboratories of suffering, where innocence was currency and pain was the price of progress. Science, stripped of ethics, merged with state and church to form a trinity of exploitation, each justifying the other, each hiding behind the veil of benevolence. What began as a sanctuary had transformed into a factory of experiments, and those who entered rarely left whole. When death finally came to the orphans, whether through disease, neglect, or the knife, their fate did not end with burial, because many were never buried at all. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, America's hunger for cadavers to fuel its growing medical schools had outpaced the supply, and orphanages quietly bridged that gap. Directors, already complicit in experiments, struck deals with anatomy professors who paid per body, no questions asked. Cart drivers arrived at night. Covered wagons parked behind kitchens or laundry sheds, and the small corpses were loaded like discarded refuse. Their names were erased from ledgers, replaced by phrases such as transferred or relocated, bureaucratic euphemisms for what was really body trafficking. Graveyards on orphanage grounds were little more than decoys, rows of weathered stones placed over empty soil, while the real remains were dissected on cold steel tables in anatomy theaters where students, laughing nervously, practiced incisions on children who had never been mourned. Some corpses were boiled down for skeletons that still hang in university cabinets today, their identity long lost, their suffering polished into academic artifacts. In Tennessee, whispered accounts speak of shallow graves near riverbanks, where unwanted bodies were dumped once they had been stripped of medical value, the earth swallowing evidence before dawn. The orphanage system became not just a machine of labor and experimentation, but also a supplier for the anatomy trade, profiting even from death. Local communities often sensed something was wrong. Families passing by claimed to hear crying from beneath the ground, and neighbors noticed how funerals were never held despite high death rates. But silence was enforced with threats, with sermons, with the constant reminder that these were not your children. And so the cycle continued, each child's body serving in life and in death as material for systems that saw them as nothing more than commodities. The tragedy is not only in the suffering, but in the erasure. No headstones, no records, no memories carried forward. Just bones carted off in the night, traded like goods, reduced to instruments of education and profit. The so-called caretakers had found a way to monetize the orphans twice, first in labor and experiments, then again in death, selling their remains into institutions that claimed to illuminate the human body while ignoring the humanity of the ones they carved open. In this, the orphanages crossed a line so absolute it stripped away any last pretense of charity. These were not homes. They were farms, where even the dead were harvested. As decades passed, the soil itself began to betray the lies carefully crafted by church, state, and science, because you cannot bury truth forever, not when it is stitched into the earth by bones. In Tennessee and beyond, construction crews digging foundations stumbled upon mass graves of children, hundreds packed into shallow pits without coffins, without markers, without dignity. Tiny skulls, fractured and sawed open, testified to dissections done not for healing but for practice. Limbs showed evidence of surgical attempts, cut clean through with tools not meant for children. Archaeologists, decades later, unearthed rows of small rib cages with identical incisions, as though the same procedure had been rehearsed over and over on bodies supplied by orphanages. And yet, when these discoveries were reported, officials were quick to dismiss them as relics of epidemics, claiming cholera or influenza had wiped out entire dormitories. But the bones themselves argued otherwise. They carried saw marks, drill holes, and chemical burns, not signs of natural disease. In some cases, skulls bore deliberate perforations, crude trepanations performed as experiments in consciousness, attempts to map the mind by breaking open the heads of children. Local communities whispered about cursed ground, saying crops planted near these sites would not grow, that rainwater turned black in ditches that ran from the burial fields. Families, generations later, began asking who these children were, where their records had gone, and why the institutions that once promised safety had erased entire ledgers of names. The answer was silence, but silence is its own confession. In the shadows of old churches and abandoned orphanages, the earth still heaves with secrets waiting to be revealed. Each unmarked grave a testimony to an industrialized cruelty that treated innocence as both resource and refuse. And in recent years, as universities quietly repatriate skeletal collections once displayed in medical cabinets, a deeper question emerges: how much of our celebrated medical progress was built not on the noble quest for knowledge, but on the silent suffering of orphans buried without names? These graves do not only hold bones, they hold indictments, proof that institutions trusted with protection instead perfected exploitation. The ground is a witness, and though officials still reach for euphemisms, every spade that strikes those fields uncovers not history, but evidence of crimes too vast to be forgotten. When the graves began to surface, when bones were pulled from the earth and questions grew too loud to silence, the machinery of suppression shifted into motion, as smooth and ruthless as it had been a century before. The state, fearful of lawsuits and scandal, declared the findings to be historical anomalies, dismissing evidence of surgical mutilation as crude 19th-century medical practice common to the era. The Church, desperate to protect its image as a moral authority, framed the mass deaths as the result of epidemics, insisting that the institutions had done their best under impossible circumstances. Academics from universities that once housed these very skeletons wrote articles filled with euphemisms, medical necessity, contextual misinterpretation. Unfortunate but understandable. Even the newspapers, which should have served as watchdogs, often parroted official lines, reporting with subdued language that robbed the graves of their horror. Behind closed doors, documents were shredded, archives sealed, and oral testimonies from survivors dismissed as unreliable. The distortions of age and trauma. But trauma does not distort. It preserves. Survivors who had lived to adulthood carried memories like scars, nights of screaming from infirmaries, friends who vanished after being taken to the special rooms, priests who told them suffering was the path to salvation. When these men and women tried to speak, they were met with polite disbelief. Treated as unstable or vengeful, their words weighed against the reputations of powerful institutions. And so, generation after generation, the official record remained clean, while the truth lived only in whispered family stories and unmarked earth. This collusion between state, church, and science was not accidental. It was structural, each reinforcing the other, each invested in keeping the myth of benevolence intact. The state needed the illusion of order, the church needed the mask of morality, and the medical establishment needed the appearance of progress unsullied by atrocity. Together they built a wall of denial so high that even when bones surfaced, even when saw marks and chemical burns stared back from the soil, the narrative remained controlled. Tragic, but not criminal. Yet every sanitized headline and doctored report is its own form of violence, erasing children all over again, burying them not only in the ground, but in silence. The suppression was not about the past. It was about control of the present, about ensuring that the same systems which once fed on orphans could continue to command trust, authority, and obedience without question. For the few survivors who dared to speak, the cost was devastating, because the institutions they accused had perfected the art of discrediting dissenters. Elderly men and women who had grown up behind orphanage walls found themselves branded as senile, their testimonies dismissed as the confused ramblings of broken minds. Some were quietly institutionalized again, this time in state hospitals, ensuring their voices would never reach the public. Others were drowned in bureaucracy, told that without documents or death certificates, their claims could not be verified, even though it was those very institutions that had erased the records. Priests thundered from pulpits that bitter souls sought to slander the good works of the church, while newspapers framed survivors as troubled individuals chasing attention. When a few managed to give sworn testimony, lawyers for the church and state shredded their credibility in court, pointing to minor inconsistencies born from trauma as proof of fabrication. Even families often turned against them, unwilling to challenge the authority of revered institutions. Yet the survivors persisted, meeting in quiet circles, passing down memories in diaries and letters, describing in detail the experiments, the disappearances, the unmarked graves. They spoke of children with shaved heads locked in cold rooms, of wards that stank of disinfectant and death, of nights when wagons came and friends never returned. Their accounts lined up with uncanny precision across time and geography, too consistent to be coincidence, yet still, officials called them delusions. This silencing was deliberate. It was easier to pathologize the survivors than to admit entire systems had committed crimes against children, and so the victims were forced to live twice in the shadows, once as children stripped of dignity, and again as adults stripped of credibility. Some died in poverty, muttering their stories to anyone who would listen, their words dismissed until decades later when archaeological digs and declassified documents confirmed fragments of what they had always claimed. But by then, many voices had already been lost to the grave, their warnings unheard, their truths unheeded. The suppression was not only about hiding the past, it was about protecting the machinery of authority, making sure that no survivor could weaken the foundations of trust upon which church, state, and science stood. Each discredited voice was another stone in the wall of silence, ensuring that the atrocities remained not as history, but as rumor, trapped between memory and denial. If bones were the first witnesses, then paper was the second, because for all the destruction of records, traces of truth still bled through in ledgers, letters, and forgotten archives, tucked away in dusty vaults. Every orphanage kept records, lists of arrivals, notes on illnesses, inventories of food, logs of deaths. Yet when investigators decades later requested these documents, they found yawning gaps. Whole years missing, entire dormitories erased, files said to have been lost in fires that curiously spared everything else. Still, fragments survived. A ledger from a Tennessee orphanage lists a dozen children marked relocated in a single week, with no indication of where they were sent. A bureaucratic euphemism survivors insist meant transfer to anatomy schools. A priest's private diary found in an estate sale mentions arrangements with the medical men and thanks God for turning suffering into progress. In state archives, censored correspondence between governors and orphanage directors reveals concern not for the welfare of children, but for the potential scandal if inquiries continue. Even university libraries, when pressed, have reluctantly admitted to holding cadaver catalogs from the 19th century with notations like youth specimen, approx 8 years. Cold evidence that children's bodies were traded as academic currency. The hidden paper trail is less about what it says outright than what it avoids. Deaths recorded without causes, pages ripped from bound volumes, signatures smudged as if to erase accountability. Researchers who have tried to expose these gaps often find access suddenly revoked, archives sealed under privacy protections, or their requests delayed indefinitely. The secrecy is not accidental. It is curated, managed, enforced by institutions that understand the power of paper to confirm what survivors already know. Somewhere, perhaps locked in a church basement or government vault, lie the full ledgers, the unbroken lists of names, the contracts with medical schools, the receipts for bodies. If uncovered, they would shatter the sanitized history still taught and reveal the machinery of cruelty in undeniable ink. Until then, the absence of records is its own kind of evidence, a silence so deliberate it screams. These documents, scattered or hidden, are not relics of the past. They are time bombs, proof waiting to detonate, capable of rewriting the story of American progress as one built upon the bones and erased identities of its most vulnerable children. The echoes of the orphanages did not end with their walls or their graves. They passed down silently, invisibly, through the generations, carried in the bodies and minds of descendants who never saw the horrors firsthand, yet lived their consequences. Trauma, as modern psychology confirms, is not confined to memory. It is inherited. Children born to survivors often carried inexplicable anxiety, hypervigilance, and a profound fear of authority, behaviors traced not to events they themselves endured, but to the stress etched into their parents' very biology. Families whispered in corners about relatives who disappeared without explanation, about nights when the wind sounded like crying, about dreams that replayed violence that had never been witnessed by the dreamer, only inherited. Many grew up believing in a world where obedience and silence were survival, where curiosity was dangerous, and questioning adults brought punishment, because those lessons had been hardwired into the family psyche by the original orphanage experience. Descendants often struggled with shame and identity, as if a dark legacy had been passed like an unspoken contract, demanding compliance to a code of secrecy. Some inherited the artistic expressions of trauma, drawings of trapped children, repetitive patterns of burial imagery, journals filled with fragmented memories, but few understood their origins until long after adulthood. These echoes also manifested in careers, marriages, and social interactions. A distrust of institutions, a compulsion to hide pain, an uncanny ability to detect dishonesty, a relentless questioning of morality. Communities around former orphanages sometimes sensed the weight of this invisible inheritance. Neighbors recalled families who seemed haunted, children who avoided certain areas, adults who recoiled at authority without explanation, and so the cycle of suppressio, and fear and obedience endured, not because of bricks and mortar or ledger books and graves, but because trauma had been coded into flesh and spirit, transmitted quietly from one generation to the next. Every child born into this line carried both the shadow of abuse and the inherited knowledge of what happens when power goes unchecked, when institutions exploit innocence for labor, experimentation, or profit. It is a silent army of the affected moving through modern life, unseen, often unacknowledged, yet bearing proof of the atrocities their ancestors survived, and of the fact that history does not only live in books or bones, it lives in the bodies of those who remember without remembering, who inherit terror they cannot name but cannot escape. Inside the walls of these orphanages, the machinery of obedience was as precise as it was invisible, a system designed not merely to control bodies, but to shape minds, to cultivate fear so deeply it became internalized, self-perpetuating, almost instinctive. Children were taught early that compliance equaled survival, that any display of curiosity, resistance, or emotion beyond measured bounds would be punished, sometimes physically, often psychologically, and always strategically, leaving no trace of cruelty except the memory it etched. Schedules were rigid to the point of obsession. Waking, eating, labor, and rest dictated not for comfort or growth, but for conditioning. Punishments were meted out in ways that normalized terror. Solitary confinement in freezing rooms, withholding food under the guise of discipline, public shaming rituals that branded the mind with humiliation as permanent as scars on flesh. Even acts meant to be comforting, such as meals or warmth, were contingent on obedience, creating a Pavlovian association between compliance and safety. Staff were trained, often subtly, to enforce hierarchy through intimidation, to cultivate mistrust among children so that even companionship became dangerous. They learned to monitor one another, to report misbehavior, internalizing authority as a constant, omnipresent force. Language itself became a tool of control, directives framed as moral imperatives, scripture quoted to justify cruelty, euphemisms like special treatment and re-education, masking experimentation and abuse. The mind of the child became the locus of domination. Anxiety was embedded, fear was normalized, and autonomy was eroded until each decision was second-guessed, each impulse measured against an invisible tribunal of punishment. By the time adolescence arrived, many had internalized these mechanisms so completely that they policed themselves, replicating the behaviors that had been forced upon them, a cycle of obedience cemented long before adulthood. It was psychological engineering under the guise of care, a form of subtle, ongoing coercion that ensured the children's trauma would extend beyond the orphanage walls, that obedience and fear would persist even after release, ready to be inherited by the next generation. The genius of this cruelty was not in brutality alone, but in its invisibility. The most effective chains are the ones that bind from within, turning victims into agents of their own subjugation, their minds trained to sustain the very system that destroyed them. Despite the pervasive conditioning, some children inevitably broke, their minds unraveling under the relentless weight of fear, control, and isolation, and their stories, fragmented, whispered, and sometimes recorded, offer a window into the depths of orchestrated cruelty. Boys and girls who could no longer endure the strict regimens developed what staff later labeled hysterical behaviors, rocking back and forth for hours, speaking in fragments of memory no adult could interpret, or retreating into a silence so profound that even screams of panic ceased to exist. Diaries smuggled out decades later tell of nights when children trembled as cold water was thrown over them for minor infractions, of entire dormitories silenced for days as punishment for the actions of one, and of staff who would watch, note, and take meticulous records of these breakdowns, cataloging which children resisted, which adapted, and which completely surrendered their will. These breakdowns were not incidental. They were studied, analyzed, and often used to refine methods of control, turning suffering into a laboratory of obedience. Older children, tasked with enforcing rules on younger ones, often became unwilling accomplices, perpetuating the fear that had been instilled in them, a hierarchy of terror that mirrored military discipline, yet was infinitely more insidious. The orphans who cracked were frequently sent to special wards, euphemistic rooms where experiments were conducted under the guise of therapy, involving sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, and physical interventions that left scars both visible and invisible. Few survived unscathed. Those who did carried invisible imprints of broken trust, emotional numbness, and hypervigilance that would shape their entire adult lives. Even decades later, survivors recount the moments of collapse with a clarity that chills, the suffocating silence of dormitories at night, the knowing glance of an overseer signaling that punishment would follow, the sensation of having one's very thoughts monitored and corrected. The orchestration was meticulous, systematic, and cold, an apparatus designed to strip away not only childhood, but the capacity to resist, to question, to rebel, and in doing so, produce a population conditioned to obedience, fear, and invisibility. These children were living, breathing experiments, their minds mapped and measured, their suffering abstracted into data for institutions that would never admit the human cost. And so, while some broke visibly, all were affected invisibly, the imprint of trauma etched into every synapse, every heartbeat, every decision long after they left the orphanage grounds. The horrors within these orphanages were not the result of isolated cruelty, but of a meticulously coordinated network, where staff, administrators, and even local officials worked in concert to sustain and expand the machinery of abuse. Across Tennessee and neighboring states, records and survivor testimonies reveal that directors of multiple institutions communicated in ways that suggest standardization, reports on obedience failures, techniques that elicited breakdowns, and protocols for punishing or segregating children were shared between facilities, often under the guise of staff training seminars or educational exchanges. Letters found in archival boxes, yellowed and brittle, detail arrangements for transferring children between orphanages and medical schools, specifying ages, health conditions, and even behavioral tendencies, as if these human beings were commodities catalogued for study. Supervisors visited each other's wards to observe methods in action, taking notes on the effectiveness of sensory deprivation, isolation cells, and the calibration of fear, discussing which punishments produce the greatest internalization of obedience. Clergy members, often acting as trustees or board members, signed off on these practices, offering moral and spiritual justification for what were essentially scientific experiments on children, while local officials provided tacit approval by failing to investigate or report suspicious deaths. In some cases, orphanages coordinated with medical universities, sending children under the label of anatomical study or psychological observation, complete with shipping lists, receipts, and correspondence that indicated prior knowledge of what would occur. These networks extended beyond institutions into communities. Neighbors were warned to keep quiet. Local businesses supplied equipment or disposables without question and wit. Sailblowers were silenced with threats, bribes, or public denunciation. It was a system designed to operate invisibly in plain sight, with every participant understanding their role in sustaining the narrative of benevolence while exploiting the most vulnerable. The breadth of coordination suggests that the atrocities were systemic, embedded into the very culture of child welfare at the time, not aberrations of individual malice. And while decades of exposure have revealed fragments of this network, the full extent remains hidden, buried in vaults, diaries, and ledgers that authorities guard jealously, leaving us to piece together the picture from whispers, bones, and the rare, stubborn survivor willing to speak. This was not merely a failure of oversight. It was a conspiracy of institutions, each complicit in ensuring that the machinery of control, exploitation, and silence functioned uninterrupted, shaping generations in shadow before the world ever knew what had been lost. Some of the children who survived the relentless machinery of orphanage abuse carried with them a spark of defiance, a quiet but persistent will to resist the system that had sought to erase their humanity. And as they grew older, many became agents of revelation, trying in small ways to expose the networks that had controlled them. They kept diaries, letters, and secret records, smuggling them out when possible, preserving the names, dates, and events that institutions had tried to obliterate. A few managed to testify in court against former staff, though these efforts were met with derision, legal obstruction, and the predictable defense strategies of erasure and discrediting. Some organized clandestine meetings with other survivors, comparing notes, corroborating stories, and mapping the invisible web of abuses that spanned multiple orphanages, towns, and even states. In rare instances, investigative journalists were granted access to these accounts, publishing pieces that hinted at the horror but were often watered down, censored, or ignored, because the institutions involved had cultivated reputations untouchable by mere testimony. Others dedicated their lives to documenting patterns, using meticulous record-keeping, photographs, and interviews to reconstruct what official archives had obliterated. They traced the movements of children, the transfers between facilities, the strange disappearances, the anonymous burials, and even the financial incentives that had motivated administrators and medical schools to cooperate in silence. Yet, even among survivors, there were obstacles. Decades of trauma had left many mistrustful, reluctant to relive the past, or unwilling to challenge authority for fear of retaliation or disbelief. Still, these determined few persisted, driven by an understanding that their memories, painful, fragmented, and raw, were the only proof of the system that had operated so efficiently in darkness. Each diary uncovered, each ledger reconstructed, each corroborated story chipped away at the wall of institutional denial, exposing not only the cruelty inflicted upon a generation of children, but the societal willingness to look away. They understood that revealing the truth was not just an act of personal justice, it was a threat to a legacy built on secrecy, fear, and complicity, and that even in their own survival, they were battling the inertia of decades of erasure. In the modern era, fragments of the orphanage network have begun to emerge from decades of deliberate erasure, thanks to historians, archivists, and researchers who pieced together what was never meant to be found. Dusty ledgers, smuggled letters, court transcripts, and private diaries reveal patterns that were otherwise invisible. Children transferred without explanation, payments from orphanages to medical schools, directives signed by directors and clergy, and personal accounts of staff boasting about methods to enforce obedience and fear. Archaeological investigations at former orphanage sites have unearthed human remains, hidden chambers, and remnants of isolation cells, confirming what survivors had long feared, that children had been buried in unmarked graves, their disappearances quietly documented as routine departures or relocations. Even when some documents have been declassified, they are often heavily redacted, leaving tantalizing clues and frustrating gaps that suggest officials understood the crimes but sought to protect institutional reputations rather than children's lives. Researchers cross-reference census data, newspaper notices, and survivor testimonies to reconstruct who went missing, when, and under what circumstances, revealing that these abuses were far more systematic and geographically widespread than previously admitted. Some universities quietly acknowledge that historical anatomical collections included bodies obtained through these orphanage networks, though public statements are carefully worded to minimize culpability. Online survivor networks and independent historians collaborate internationally, sharing evidence, photographs, and oral histories to trace the chain of complicity. Yet every discovery is met with obstacles, legal roadblocks, sealed archives, and institutional denials. Each uncovered fragment feels like a battle, a slow excavation of truth against centuries of denial and protectionism. Yet the persistence of these modern investigators ensures that what was once invisible now has the potential to be named, catalogued, and confronted. The chilling realization emerges that this network was never isolated to one orphanage, one town, or one state. It was a carefully maintained system of control, exploitation, and silence, and the truth, though painstakingly reconstructed, threatens to topple the comfortable narratives of benevolence that generations of institutions have relied upon to mask their crimes. The legacy of these orphanages did not vanish with their closure. It lingered like a shadow over entire communities, subtly shaping the social fabric and embedding fear and mistrust into the collective consciousness. Neighbors who once witnessed children disappearing or acting strangely often refused to speak, and the silence became part of the landscape, a code of avoidance that persisted for generations. Entire towns developed unspoken rules. Avoid the old orphanage grounds, never question the authorities, and never speak of what you saw, because curiosity could draw the attention of power and place you in danger. Survivors carried trauma into adulthood, and their behaviors, hypervigilance, distrust, anxiety, withdrawal, rippled through families, infecting the very culture of the neighborhoods around them. Descendants of these children often struggled with fragmented identities, carrying gaps in family histories, unexplained absences, or a pervasive sense of unease they could not name. Some discovered hidden documents, photographs, or belongings decades later, and in doing so, unearthed truths that redefined their understanding of who they were and what had been stolen from them. The psychological imprint extended beyond families. Educators, social workers, and even local officials were shaped by the long-term secrecy, carrying forward unconscious lessons about obedience, control, and complicity. In towns surrounding former orphanages, whispers persisted, of cries in the night, of shadows in empty buildings, of strange rituals or anomalies no one could fully explain. These lingering effects were a form of societal haunting, invisible but persistent, reminding the living that institutional cruelty does not end when the doors close. It seeps into the culture, infects relationships, and erodes trust. Communities, unaware or unwilling to fully confront this, became vessels for inherited trauma, preserving the patterns of control and silence that the orphanages had perfected. Even as modern investigators uncover records and unearth hidden graves, the emotional and cultural residue remains, proving that the machinery of fear and manipulation is not confined to history. It lives in the present, in the minds, behaviors, and interactions of those who carry fragments of memory, unspoken truths, and the inherited weight of the abused and forgotten. Over the decades, countless accounts emerged from locals, investigators, and descendants describing phenomena that defied easy explanation, the lingering echoes of trauma and fear manifesting as something almost supernatural, as if the orphanages had imprinted themselves on the very land and the air above it. Visitors to abandoned sites reported sudden drops in temperature, unaccountable cold drafts, and a pervasive sense of being watched, even when alone. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways, doors creaked without wind, and whispers of children calling out could be heard on nights when the moon barely illuminated the ruins. Survivors and their descendants often described sleep disturbances, nightmares, and intrusive memories triggered by proximity to these locations, with some experiencing dissociation or hallucinations when recalling fragments of childhood experiences they had been too young to process. Even modern researchers, armed with cameras and recording devices, captured inexplicable anomalies, shadowed figures, strange sounds, and electronic disturbances on devices, all meticulously documented but frustratingly resistant to scientific explanation. Psychologists examining these reports point to a complex interplay of inherited trauma, environmental memory, and heightened hypervigilance, suggesting that the imprint of sustained fear and abuse can create perceptual distortions so vivid that they are indistinguishable from reality. Yet the effect is more than personal. Communities surrounding these orphanages often maintained folklore about restless spirits, crying heard in the woods, or children seen fleetingly at dusk. Stories dismissed as legend but corroborated across generations and geographies. Some theorists propose that these phenomena reflect a psychic residue, the collective suffering of hundreds, possibly thousands of children whose lives were governed by terror and whose cries were never answered. The result is a haunting that is simultaneously psychological, historical, and cultural, a persistent reminder that the orphanage's influence extended far beyond physical walls and temporal limits, embedding itself in consciousness, memory, and imagination. It is a haunting that continues to shape perception, evoke fear, and demand acknowledgement, forcing those who come into contact with these places to confront the dark legacy of systemic abuse and the invisible chains it left upon both individuals and communities alike. In recent years, descendants, historians, and forensic experts have begun using modern technology to pierce the veil that has long obscured the fates of these children, employing tools that the original institutions could never have imagined. DNA analysis allows for the identification of remains found in unmarked graves, connecting them to living relatives, and finally restoring names to those erased from records. Forensic archaeology carefully maps the grounds of abandoned orphanages, uncovering hidden burial sites, structural anomalies, and evidence of secretive cells or tunnels that speak to the calculated cruelty of the administrators. Artificial intelligence and data modeling are being applied to cross-reference historical documents, newspapers, census data, and survivor testimonies, revealing patterns of transfers, disappearances, and correspondence that expose the networks of abuse as systemic rather than isolated. Some genealogists are tracing family trees, reconstructing lineages that were deliberately obscured, and piecing together stories lost for generations, giving voice to children whose existence was minimized or erased. This technology also enables predictive analysis, identifying likely locations of undocumented graves or orphanages that have left only the faintest traces in local records, allowing researchers to focus investigative resources with unprecedented precision. Meanwhile, online archives and survivor networks act as living repositories where scattered evidence can be centralized, compared, and verified, creating a digital memory for a history that institutions tried to erase. Each discovery is a small act of reclamation, restoring identity, dignity, and humanity to lives that were systematically devalued, while simultaneously exposing the depth of the conspiracy that sought to conceal them. Yet, even as names are restored and histories reconstructed, the process is emotionally harrowing for families and descendants, revealing atrocities that are both personal and systemic, a chilling testament to how power, secrecy, and indifference enabled generations of children to suffer. The convergence of science, technology, and determined human persistence is finally challenging the silence, proving that no matter how deeply the past is buried, truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, demanding acknowledgement, justice, and remembrance. As the evidence mounts and the stories of survivors and descendants gain traction, society and legal institutions have begun responding, albeit slowly and unevenly, to the dark legacy of these orphanages, revealing the tension between acknowledgement and the inertia of power. Lawsuits have emerged, often decades after the fact, targeting both the institutions themselves and the governing bodies that allowed such abuses to persist, forcing courts to confront the uncomfortable reality that systemic cruelty was not merely anecdotal, but meticulously documented, sanctioned, and concealed. Commissions of inquiry have been established in some states, tasked with investigating historical orphanage practices, reviewing archival records, interviewing survivors, and making recommendations for restitution or memorialization, though bureaucratic red tape and political hesitation frequently hinder progress. Public awareness campaigns, documentaries, and academic research have begun to pierce the collective denial, compelling communities to acknowledge the unspoken truths that shaped generations, and some localities have erected memorials to honor the children whose lives were stolen or irrevocably altered. Mental health professionals have been called upon to provide care for aging survivors and for descendants grappling with intergenerational trauma, recognizing that the consequences of fear, control, and neglect extend far beyond the immediate victims. Yet, the process of institutional accountability is painstaking, often hampered by lost records, the deaths of key witnesses, and the legal complexities of retroactively applying modern ethical standards to past actions. Even as apologies are issued, compensations considered, and memorials dedicated, the psychological and societal scars remain vivid, a stark reminder that acknowledgement alone cannot erase the imprint of systemic cruelty. What is undeniable, however, is that the combination of legal action, historical reckoning, and survivor advocacy is beginning to dismantle the carefully maintained veil of secrecy, forcing institutions and society to confront uncomfortable truths, to bear witness to suffering that was deliberately silenced, and to recognize the profound human cost of obedience, fear, and control orchestrated in the name of care. In this reckoning, the orphanages no longer exist merely as abandoned buildings. They live as enduring symbols of complicity, silence, and the consequences of unchecked power. The shadow of these orphanages continues to stretch into modern child welfare systems and societal attitudes toward authority, revealing how deeply institutionalized fear and control can persist across generations. Practices once considered cruel but necessary have echoes today in the rigid enforcement of obedience, punitive measures disguised as discipline, and bureaucratic indifference to individual suffering within foster care and state-run institutions. Social workers, educators, and even policymakers often inherit frameworks built on obedience, hierarchy, and compliance, inadvertently perpetuating patterns of neglect or emotional suppression that were first perfected in the orphanages of the past. Survivors' families report that trauma can manifest as hypervigilance, mistrust of authority, or internalized shame, psychological remnants that influence parenting, relationships, and community interactions, effectively transmitting the orphanage's lessons of fear and submission long after the buildings themselves have crumbled. At the same time, descendants and advocates are challenging these inherited norms, demanding transparency, empathy, and systemic reform, forcing institutions to confront a history they would rather forget and to recognize the human cost of prioritizing control over care. This ongoing tension between old hierarchies and new accountability creates a societal struggle. On one side, the inertia of authority and normalized obedience. On the other, the insistence that history must inform present-day ethics and protection. The orphanages, though physically gone, live on as cautionary symbols, reminders that unchecked power, secrecy, and institutional complicity do not disappear with time. They evolve, often invisibly, shaping policies, practices, and cultural perceptions of children, trust, and authority. Every reform, every survivor testimony, every archival revelation is a battle to reclaim what was stolen: agency, voice, and recognition of humanity. And in acknowledging the persistence of these patterns, society is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: that trauma is not confined to the past, and the lessons of these haunted orphanages continue to reverberate, demanding vigilance, awareness, and a willingness to dismantle the invisible systems of control that still echo through modern life. The reckoning, when it comes, is both symbolic and transformative, a confrontation with truths so long suppressed that their revelation feels almost violent, shaking the foundations of memory, identity, and authority itself. Survivors and descendants, armed with documentation, DNA evidence, and collective testimony, begin to reclaim narratives that were stolen, naming names, exposing networks of complicity, and demanding acknowledgement of the pain inflicted not only on children, but on generations thereafter. Communities, once complicit through silence or ignorance, are forced to confront the ghosts in their midst, to recognize that the ruins of orphanages are more than decaying wood and stone. They are physical embodiments of control, cruelty, and erasure, and their influence has been felt in the attitudes, behaviors, and fears of those who lived in their shadow. This reckoning extends beyond legal restitution. It is an awakening of consciousness, a breaking of the cycles of obedience, secrecy, and suppression that the orphanages perfected. Survivors speak, historians write, psychologists analyze, and society listens, slowly internalizing the lesson that systemic abuse thrives when the powerful are unchecked and the powerless remain silent. Descendants reclaim not only the identities of missing ancestors, but also the moral authority to challenge institutional narratives, to demand transparency, and to reconstruct histories that had been deliberately fragmented. And as these truths emerge, they create a dangerous clarity, a knowledge that shifts perception, reshapes understanding, and transforms the individual, the family, and the community. It is the kind of awakening that changes men and women permanently, forcing them to see the world not as it is presented, but as it operates beneath the surface, a latticework of control, manipulation, fear, and erasure. Those who confront these revelations are no longer mere witnesses. They become participants in a moral and historical reclamation, bearers of knowledge that institutions hoped would remain buried forever, and guardians of a legacy that demands recognition, justice, and memory. And so, the story comes full circle, leaving us in the quiet, suffocating aftermath of truths long buried yet impossible to ignore, a meditation on the enduring legacy of America's haunted orphanages that is as unsettling as it is necessary. The buildings may have collapsed, the administrators passed into obscurity, and the immediate victims aged or died, but the imprint of their cruelty persists, etched into the land, the laws, the collective psyche, and the very DNA of descendants who bear the echoes of suffering they never consented to inherit. Every hidden grave, every altered record, every suppressed testimony speaks to a network of control and corruption that thrived on silence, on the assumption that the powerless would remain invisible, voiceless, and obedient. And yet the persistence of memory, the determination of researchers, and the courage of survivors and descendants ensure that this darkness cannot remain unchallenged. It forces society to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil often masquerades as benevolence, that institutions entrusted with care can become instruments of oppression, and that history is never truly dead if its lessons are ignored. As we step away from these ruins, the message is clear. Vigilance is not optional. Awareness is not negotiable, and the consequences of silence ripple across generations. Those who choose to remember, to bear witness, and to speak are part of a transformation that honors the lost, exposes the complicit, and reshapes understanding of power, morality, and responsibility. In the end, the haunted orphanages of Tennessee are more than a story. They are a mirror, reflecting the depths of human cruelty, the resilience of those who endure, and the unrelenting imperative to never allow such darkness to fester again. Their legacy is a warning, a challenge, and a call to action, leaving us with the knowledge that what is hidden, no matter how long, will always demand to be seen, understood, and never forgotten.